Does the Qur'an mention DNA? The Qur'an almost never omits a fundamental scientific principle. DNA is one of the chemical wonders of the universe. So there are verses from which we can deduce that it's a reference to the DNA molecule. But first, let me just clarify a few important concepts. The Arabic word Rabb, commonly translated as Lord, which refers to the master or a superior being. In the Arabic language, it is a much deeper meaning, and that is that of a reference to the one who guides a thing through stages from simplicity to complexity until it reaches its goal of relative completion. Then there's another important Arabic word, Halk, which means to create from nothing, but it also means to fashion, to shape, and to adapt over extended periods of time. Now let's consider two important verses quickly. In chapter 30, verse 20, it says, He evolved you from the fundamental constituents of the earth, though you have been scattered far and wide. And in chapter 40, verse 67, it says, He evolved you from the constituents of the earth arranged in layers. Now from these two verses, we can deduce that the origin of life can be traced to the chemicals of the earth. Now note the important word, layers of chemicals, in the second verse. It's probably a reference to crystal structures, because these are layers or identical rows of molecules arranged in a recurring pattern in layers, and is believed to have played an important role in the origin of life. Now let's move to chapter 4, verse 1. This is the traditional translation. It says, He created you from a single soul, a single person, and from the same person created its complementary partner, and through the complete pair multiplied into a multitude of men and women. Now you can see here that the idea that the whole of mankind can be traced to a single soul doesn't make sense. So let's look at a much better translation, which I'll explain to you later how I arrived at that translation. It says, He evolved you from a single complex chemical entity, and from this same chemical entity evolved its complementary part, and through the complete pair to the successive divisions multiplied you into a multitude of men and women. My insertion is derived from the description of cells and its division in my book Document Exoteric Evidence of God's Existence. If you incorporate into this verse that those two words I mentioned earlier, that of Rab and Halk, and the two verses allude to the origin of life from the non-living matter of the earth, then one can make the deduction that the simple matter of the earth combined to form more complex material. And this process of chemical build-up continued until a key complex chemical structure emerged. Now the Arabic word for this particular chemical is that of nafs. Now nafs in Arabic has two meanings: a single living cell or a single living entity. And the other meaning is that of a vital principle. And the vital principle refers to non-living chemicals which gave rise to life. These are the chemicals which gave rise to that key molecular structure I mentioned to you earlier, and which I have translated as a single chain DNA molecule. Now I will obviously explain to you the background of this interpretation. I need to add that the meaning of nafs as a complex chemical entity is derived. It is based on the Qur'anic concept of evolution, the two important Arabic words I mentioned earlier, and those two verses, which speak about the origin of man from the primitive earth, and thirdly, the context. If you explore once again chapter 4, verse 1, it refers to simple chemical material which one can deduce evolved to more complex substances. And lastly, the other meaning of nafs, which is that of a single living essence. The most commonly employed meaning of nafs is the traditional understanding, that is, of a soul, which is derived from biblical influences, and which I've demonstrated renders chapter 4 verse 1 meaningless and should therefore be rejected. This single-chain chemical entity represents an intermediate stage going from non-like to life. Now, from this particular molecule evolved a similar molecule, maybe at the same time or subsequently. These two single chains combine, forming a double-stranded chemical substance. And once a structure formed, the property of spontaneous replication emerged. Now, the word pair is important here because these two chains or these two molecules that combined is not two random chains, but rather they have a unique chemical relation. They are complementary. Now, with all this information, we can now retranslate chapter 4 verse 1 as follows. He evolved you from a single living chemical entity. From the same entity evolved its complementary part, and through the complete pair to successive divisions multiplied you into a multitude of men and women. Now, if we apply this translation to the last part of this verse, it speaks about the multitude of men and women, and to the first part of the verse, which refers to the single cell, we can deduce that life began as a single cell, and this cell started to replicate continuously, and this continuous replication eventually gave rise to the explosion of life. When the first cell emerged, it contained DNA material. Remember, the Arabic meaning of nafs is that of a single cell and that of the chemical material I spoke to you about earlier, which I translated as DNA material. Now, when this first cell replicated, the DNA within that first cell also had to make a copy of itself, and this copy was transferred to the daughter cell. So with replication, the identical copy of DNA was transmitted to the daughter cell, and this was necessary for the daughter cell to sustain itself, because it required an exact copy of DNA so that the DNA could continue its important functions for the cell to sustain itself. Now let us move to another verse here. I'm sort of jumping around there, but we'll see the bigger picture in a moment. In chapter 80 verse 19, it says, "He creates you from a minimal quantity of liquid containing a fertilized egg, and then lays down the plan in the context of the genetic plan, which decides the features of the organism. This means the fertilized egg contains the genetic instructions, which is none other than the DNA molecule, which determine the features or the traits of the organism, and hence the species type. You are human because of human DNA. Plant has plant DNA, chimp has chimp DNA, and so forth." Then move to another verse, 87 verse 3. It says, "It is God that originates all living things, thereupon shapes in proportions and symmetrically for the just adaptation of its component parts to the performance of its function." Now, it sounds like a mouthful here, but what it's basically saying is that the animal is continuously being reshaped and resized in response to environmental factors. And this is controlled by the genetic instructions, in other words, the DNA molecule. This happens, as the verse states, so that the organs become consistent with the functions they are meant to perform. Now just follow this. Remember, the DNA sequence dictates anatomical features and the traits of the organism. Now, since the animal is constantly undergoing change, the DNA which dictate those changes must also change. In other words, it must mutate. The mutation is one of the key features of DNA. Now let's go back to chapter 4 verse 1. I'm just going to read it again to you. It says, "He evolved you from a single living cell, and from a similar cell evolved its complementary partner, and through the complete pair, through successive divisions, multiplied you into a multitude of men and women. Later, when DNA was discovered, we could update this translation to mean the following. Remember that the word nafs has two meanings, that of a single cell and that of DNA material. So we can therefore say that the first cell that emerged had a single chain of DNA material. In other words, half the number of chromosomes of a normal cell. And this gamete fused with another similar cell. And once they combined the chromosome, the resultant cell had the full complement of chromosomes. And that allowed it to replicate. So the whole process of life was set in motion. Now, this is not material that has been proved. So the Quran provides us insights as to what might have happened in the beginning. That the whole life process started off with a cell containing half the number of chromosomes, each chromosome possessing a copy of DNA, the single chain type, which can then combine with a similar cell. And once they combine, the full set of chromosomes were in place. This enabled the cell to divide, which set the whole life process in motion. Now, we see therefore, if you look at the verse, the Quran described the essential features of the DNA molecule. That is a double-stranded molecule. It has a paired structure. It can transmit information. It can replicate. And it can mutate. And there's only one molecule that reveals these features. That is the DNA molecule.